Good morning, my friends. Today I want to talk to you about the most important meeting of your life, the moment you come face to face with God. Not just in the grand eternity beyond, but here now, in the quiet moments of your day, in the trials of your life, in the places you least expect. He is with you in the storm when life feels uncertain. He is walking beside you in the valleys, in the victories, in the waiting. The question isn't whether God is near, it's whether you recognize Him when He shows up. Today I want to help you see that no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, God is waiting to meet with you. And when you truly meet Him, it changes everything. In the fast-paced, noisy world we live in, silence has become a rare treasure. Everywhere we turn, there is something demanding our attention. Our phones, our schedules, our responsibilities, and the endless stream of distractions that fill our days. It is easy to believe that God speaks to us only in grand, dramatic ways, through miracles, signs, or powerful experiences. But the truth is, some of the most profound moments with God happen in stillness, in the quiet corners of our lives where we intentionally set aside the noise and listen. God has always worked in the silence. Throughout the Bible, we see that when people sought Him in stillness, they found Him. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah experienced this firsthand. After a great wind, an earthquake, and a fire, Elijah did not find God in any of them. But then came a gentle whisper. And there, in the quiet, was the presence of God. This moment teaches us something vital. God often speaks in ways that require us to be still enough to hear Him. But in today's world, stillness is not something that comes naturally. We have to fight for it. We have to be intentional about creating space for God in our lives. It is easy to fill our moments of quiet with distractions. Checking messages, scrolling through social media, or thinking about the next task on our list. But if we are always filling our minds with noise, we leave little room for God to speak. Stillness before God is more than just the absence of noise. It is an attitude of the heart. It is about being fully present with Him, shutting out everything else, and focusing on His voice. It is in these quiet moments that He reveals His heart to us, gives us wisdom, and strengthens our faith. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." This is not just a suggestion. It is an invitation to step away from the chaos and rest in His presence. There is a deep peace that comes when we learn to embrace stillness. In a world that constantly tells us to do more, achieve more, and always be moving, God calls us to pause, to sit in His presence and allow Him to renew us. Many times we feel spiritually dry, distant from God, or overwhelmed by life, and we assume that the solution is to do more, pray harder, read more scriptures, serve more. While all these things are good, sometimes what we truly need is to simply be still before God. Jesus Himself modeled this for us. Throughout His ministry, He took time to withdraw from the crowds and spend time alone with the Father. Despite the demands of His mission, the needs of the people, and the urgency of His work, He prioritized stillness. He understood that true strength, true guidance, and true connection with the Father came in the quiet moments. If Jesus needed stillness with God, how much more do we? One of the greatest challenges in finding stillness is our own restlessness. Many of us struggle with quiet because in the silence, we are confronted with our own thoughts, our fears, our doubts. But God meets us there too. When we bring our worries before Him in the stillness, He replaces them with His peace. When we lay down our burdens at His feet, He reminds us that He is in control. Stillness is not just about what we receive from God. It is also about learning to trust Him. It is easy to believe that we must always be doing something, always working, always striving. But stillness teaches us dependence. It reminds us that God is the one in control, not us. That His plans are unfolding even when we cannot see them. that his voice is speaking even when we do not hear it immediately. The practice of stillness before God is something that must be cultivated. It requires discipline, patience, and a willingness to set aside distractions. It may mean waking up earlier to spend quiet time in prayer. It may mean turning off the noise at the end of the day and sitting in his presence without an agenda. It may mean stepping outside into nature and simply listening. Whatever it looks like, the key is to make room for God to speak. Here's the expanded version of your second key point. Life is full of challenges. There are moments when the weight of trials seems unbearable, when difficulties press in from every side, and when the path ahead appears uncertain. It is in these times of struggle that we often wonder where God is. We question why we must endure suffering and why he allows hardship in our lives. But if we look closely, we will find that trials are often the very places where God meets us most powerfully. Throughout Scripture, we see that God does not always remove the trials from our lives, but he walks with us through them. One of the most powerful examples of this is found in the book of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship an idol. The flames were real, the danger was real, and yet in the midst of the fire they were not alone. A fourth figure appeared with them, one whom many believe was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. The fire did not consume them, and they emerged unharmed. This story teaches us that God does not always keep us from the fire, but he is always with us in it. Trials have a way of drawing us closer to God in a way that comfort never can. When everything is going well, it is easy to rely on our own strength, to feel self-sufficient, and to forget our need for God. But when we face hardships, whether it is sickness, financial struggles, broken relationships, or personal loss, we are reminded of our dependence on him. These are the moments when we come to the end of ourselves and realize that we need a power greater than our own. God allows trials not to destroy us, but to refine us. In James 1:2-4, we are told to consider it pure joy when we face trials, because they produce perseverance, maturity, and completeness in us. This perspective is difficult to embrace when we are in the middle of suffering, but when we look back, we often see that the hardest seasons of our lives were also the times when God was doing his greatest work in us. Consider Job, a man who lost everything, his wealth, his family, his health. Yet in his deep suffering, he encountered God in a way he never had before. At the end of his trials, Job declared, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." Job chapter 3, verse 42-5. Trials deepen our relationship with God because they strip away the distractions and force us to seek him with all our hearts. God also uses trials to shape our character. Just as gold is refined in fire, our faith is purified through hardship. We may not understand why we are going through a particular trial, but we can trust that God is using it for our good. Romans 8:28 assures us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. This does not mean that everything we face will be easy or pleasant, but it does mean that God has a purpose in our pain. One of the most reassuring truths in times of trial is that God never wastes our suffering. Every tear we cry, every hardship we endure is seen and known by him. He promises to bring beauty from ashes, to restore what is broken, and to use our trials as a testimony of his faithfulness. Many of the greatest spiritual leaders and heroes of faith did not become who they were because of ease and comfort. They became who they were because they walked through trials and encountered God in the process. Another way God meets us in trials is by giving us his peace. When Jesus was in the boat with his disciples and a great storm arose, the disciples were terrified. They thought they were going to perish. But Jesus, in the midst of the storm, spoke these words, "Peace, be still." Immediately the storm calmed. This moment shows us that while God may not always take away our storms, he gives us peace in the midst of them. His presence is our anchor when everything around us feels unstable. Trials also teach us to trust God in ways we never have before. When we have no other choice but to lean on Him, our faith grows stronger. It is in the difficult seasons that we truly learn what it means to surrender and rely on His strength rather than our own. Many of us want to experience God's power in our lives, but we forget that His power is most evident in our weakness. As Paul said in Corinthians 12:9, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." When we look back on our lives, we will see that some of our most powerful encounters with God happened in the midst of trials. It is often in the broken places that we experience His presence the most. God does not abandon us in our suffering. He draws near, He strengthens, and He walks with us through every storm we face. Here's the expanded version of your third key point. Life is a journey filled with moments of joy, hardship, uncertainty, and growth. But one thing remains constant. God is always present. However, we often miss seeing Him because we are not looking in the right places. Many people expect to meet God only in church, during a powerful worship service, or in a sacred setting. But the truth is, God is not limited to a building, a time, or a place. He meets us in the ordinary moments of life just as much as in the extraordinary ones. God is present in our daily routines, in the simple moments that we often overlook. He is with us in the morning when we wake up, in the quietness of our thoughts, in the conversations we have with others, and in the decisions we make throughout the day. Sometimes we are so focused on waiting for a dramatic encounter with God that we fail to see Him in the small, everyday blessings He gives us. The laughter of a child, the beauty of a sunrise, the comfort of a friend. These are all ways in which God shows Himself to us. One of the most powerful examples of meeting God in the ordinary is found in the story of Moses. Before Moses became the great leader who led the Israelites out of Egypt, he was simply a shepherd tending his flock. He was going about his usual routine when he encountered God in the burning bush, Exodus 3:1-4. This teaches us an important lesson. God can meet us anywhere, even in the middle of what seems like an ordinary day. We don't have to wait for a special occasion to hear from Him. He is speaking even now if we are willing to listen. Jesus also demonstrated this truth throughout His ministry. He didn't just meet people in synagogues or religious gatherings. He met them in the marketplace, by the sea, at their workplaces, in their homes, and even along the roads they traveled. He met Peter while he was fishing. He met Zacchaeus while he was perched in a tree. He met the woman at the well as she was simply drawing water. These encounters remind us that God is not distant. He is near, and He meets us right where we are. One of the greatest challenges we face is recognizing God in the ordinary. We often separate our spiritual lives from our daily lives, as if God is only involved in one part but not the other. But in reality, He is present in everything we do. He is there when we are working, studying, eating, resting, or simply going about our daily responsibilities. The key is to cultivate an awareness of His presence, to invite Him into every aspect of our lives, and to open our hearts to see Him in the little things. Sometimes we struggle to recognize God in the ordinary because we are too distracted. Our minds are constantly occupied with tasks, worries, and responsibilities. We rush from one thing to another without pausing to acknowledge His presence. But when we slow down, when we take a moment to reflect and be still, we begin to see how God has been with us all along. God also meets us through people. He speaks through the kindness of a stranger, the wisdom of a mentor, the encouragement of a friend, and even through unexpected conversations. Have you ever had someone say exactly what you needed to hear at just the right time? That is not a coincidence. That is God working through them to reach you. He uses the people around us to remind us of His love, His guidance, and His faithfulness. Even in the mundane task of life, God is at work. Whether we are washing dishes, driving to work, or taking care of our families, He is there. Brother Lawrence, a 17th century monk, wrote about the idea of practicing the presence of God in everyday tasks. He found joy and purpose in doing simple things like washing pots and pans because he did them as an act of worship. This is a powerful reminder that we don't have to be in a specific place or doing something extraordinary to experience God. He is present in every moment when our hearts are turned toward Him. Recognizing God in the ordinary also strengthens our faith. When we start to see His hand in the small things, we begin to trust Him more in the big things. We realize that He is not just a distant God we seek on Sundays, but a loving Father who is with us in every moment of our lives. This awareness shifts our perspective, turning everyday moments into opportunities for worship, gratitude, and deeper connection with Him. God does not hide from us. He is constantly revealing Himself in ways both big and small. The question is, are we paying attention? Here's the expanded version of your fourth key point. Life is full of uncertainties. No matter how much we try to plan our future, control our circumstances, or anticipate what lies ahead, there are moments when we find ourselves in seasons of waiting. Waiting for answers, waiting for direction, waiting for healing, waiting for a breakthrough. These seasons can feel frustrating, discouraging, and even hopeless at times. But what if I told you that the waiting place is one of the most powerful places where you can meet with God? Waiting is never easy. It challenges our patience, tests our faith, and exposes our deepest fears. When we are in a waiting season, we often ask questions like, God, where are you? Why haven't you answered my prayers? When will this change? But in the silence of waiting, God is not absent. He is working. He is shaping us, refining us, and drawing us closer to Him in ways that we may not fully understand in the moment. The Bible is filled with stories of people who met God in their waiting. Abraham waited 25 years for the fulfillment of God's promise that he would have a son. Joseph waited in prison for years before stepping into his God-given purpose. The Israelites waited 40 years in the wilderness before entering the promised land. David was anointed as king, but had to wait many years before he actually took the throne. And even Jesus Himself waited for the appointed time to begin His ministry. These stories remind us that waiting is not wasted time. It is a divine process of preparation. One of the greatest challenges of waiting is that it often feels like nothing is happening. We pray, we seek God, and yet we see no immediate change. But just because we cannot see what God is doing does not mean He is doing nothing. Just as a seed planted in the ground takes time to sprout and grow, God's work in our lives often takes time to develop before we see the fruit. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Waiting is not just about patience. It's about renewing our strength in God. Waiting also teaches us trust. When we have no choice but to wait, we are forced to surrender our control and put our faith in God's timing rather than our own. Trusting God in the waiting means believing that His plan is better than ours, even when we don't understand it. It means resting in the truth that He sees the full picture while we only see a small piece. Proverbs 3:05-6 reminds us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. God does not ask us to understand everything. He asks us to trust Him. Another important lesson we learn in waiting is dependence on God. When everything is going well, it is easy to rely on our own strength. But in waiting, we are reminded of our need for Him. Waiting deepens our prayer life, strengthens our relationship with God, and refines our faith. It is in the waiting season that we learn to hear His voice more clearly, to lean on His promises more deeply, and to seek His presence more earnestly. Sometimes God allows waiting to protect us from something we are not ready for. We may think we are prepared for a certain opportunity, relationship, or responsibility, but God knows what is best for us. Just like a loving parent who does not give their child something they are not mature enough to handle, God withholds certain things until the right time. What may seem like a delay to us is often God's way of positioning us for something even greater than we imagined. Waiting also has a way of purifying our desires. Many times we begin waiting for one thing but end up realizing that what we truly need is something different. Perhaps we start by waiting for a specific job, a relationship, or a breakthrough, but in the process we discover that what we actually need is more of God. He shifts our focus from the thing we are waiting for to the one we are waiting on. One of the most powerful truths about waiting is that it is temporary. No waiting season lasts forever. God is always moving, always leading, always working behind the scenes. And when the waiting is over, we will look back and realize that He was with us the entire time, shaping us, preparing us, and drawing us closer to Him in ways we never expect. Here's the expanded version of your fifth key po. There are moments in life when we reach the end of our strength. We face battles that seem too great, burdens that feel too heavy, and situations where we simply do not have the power to move forward on our own. In these moments of weakness, we often feel alone, exhausted, and even defeated. But it is in these very moments that God meets us with His power. The world teaches us that strength comes from self-reliance, that we must push through difficulties by our own willpower and determination. We are told to be strong, to keep going, and to handle it on our own. But the truth is, real strength does not come from ourselves. It comes from God. When we recognize our own weakness, we make room for His strength to be made perfect in us. The Apostle Paul understood this deeply. In 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10, he shares how he pleaded with God to remove a hardship from his life, but God responded, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul then says, "Therefore I would boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." This is a radical truth. The very places where we feel weakest are the places where God's power is most evident. When we are strong in ourselves, we often rely on our own abilities. But when we come to the end of our strength, we are forced to depend entirely on God. It is in these moments of surrender that His power flows through us. This is why some of the greatest victories in Scripture were won not by human might, but by divine intervention. Think about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He did not feel strong or capable. He even told God that he was not a good speaker and that he was not the right person for the job. But God's power worked through his weakness, and Moses became one of the greatest leaders in history. Consider Gideon, who saw himself as weak and insignificant. When God called him to lead Israel's army, Gideon doubted and questioned God's choice. But God did not need Gideon's strength. He only needed Gideon's willingness to trust in Him. With just 300 men, God used Gideon to defeat an entire army, proving that victory comes not from human strength, but from the power of God. Even David, before he became king, stood before the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a few stones. By human standards, David should not have won that battle. But David did not rely on his own strength. He relied on the power of God. And with one stone, God gave him victory over the giant. These stories remind us that God's power is not reserved for the strong, the mighty, or the capable. It is for those who are willing to trust Him in their weakness. Sometimes God allows us to experience weakness so that we can truly understand His power. When we have everything under control, we do not always recognize our need for Him. But when we come to the end of ourselves, we begin to see that He is our true source of strength. It is in our lowest moments, when we have nothing left to give, that we experience His sustaining power the most. God's power is not just for overcoming external battles, it is also for strengthening us from within. There are times when the greatest battles we face are not against external enemies, but against fear, doubt, anxiety, and discouragement. These battles can feel overwhelming, but God promises to strengthen us even in these internal struggles. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The beauty of God's power is that it does not depend on our circumstances. We may feel weak, we may feel overwhelmed, but His strength is constant. He is not limited by our limitations. He is not hindered by our failures. He does not require us to be strong before He moves. He moves because we trust in Him. When we are weak, we have two choices. We can struggle in our own strength and eventually wear ourselves out, or we can surrender to God and allow His power to work in us. True faith is not about having everything figured out. It is about trusting that God's strength is greater than our own. There will be times in life when we cannot carry the burden alone, but the good news is we do not have to. God never asks us to bear the weight of life struggles by ourselves. He invites us to lay our burdens at His feet, to trust in His strength, and to allow His power to sustain us. God's power is real, it is available, and it is made perfect in our weakness.